Well, last class, we talked a little bit about the origins of the Jewish people, and we spent more time on what we don't know about the origins of the Jewish people. We have versions of stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the 12 tribes as the sons of Jacob / Israel, who go down into Egypt and become a great nation there, and then an Exodus under Moses, wandering the desert for 40 years, and ultimately a conquest of the land of Israel. But there are a lot of reasons to think that those sources are not 100% believable in the version of the story we've always been told. So if we've deconstructed that version of the story, we have to try to reconstruct the real beginning as best we can decipher it, or as close as we can get to what really happened. As we discussed in our previous couple of classes, history is more of an art than a science sometimes. It's reconstructing from the spaces of what we find into what we don't know and making our best guesses and having probabilities, but not the kind of certainty that the Bible thumper will have by simply pulling out the text and saying, this is absolutely what happened. We're not going to have an absolutely what happened. Well, we're going to have a most likely scenario. And so what you do find sometimes, even in liberal Jewish sources, are attempts to save parts of this history. So there is a context for a Semitic people called the Hyksos sweeping into Egypt, conquering, setting themselves up as pharaohs, and then being overthrown by a native Egyptian rebellion. Sounds a bit like a pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. And then it is plausible that some of those Semitic tribes that were there, including the Hyksos and other peoples, were imprisoned or enslaved for a period of time. And it's also plausible that some slaves might have managed to escape from there. After all, it's a very rare people that gives its origins in slavery. Usually you want to claim noble origins for your people, right? Not slaves. Who wants to start out at the bottom? So there is a possibility that something like that did in fact happen. But that's a very different story than the Exodus story of 600,000 men, doing the math, around 2 million people wandering in the desert for 40 years with a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud and all the wonders and miracles that are described in the Torah text. And then a lightning conquest under Joshua that seems to have not left a strong record in the archaeological layers. You know, you'd think there'd be a massive burning layer over everything for all of Joshua's conquests, and there are burnings here and burnings there, but some of the most important places don't have evidence of a massive conquest like that. So this is the difference, I sometimes say, between proving the possibility of an Exodus versus confirming the reality of the Exodus. You hear the difference? An Exodus is some slaves escaping at some point. The Exodus is the traditional story. And if we don't believe the Exodus as described in the Passover Haggadah, as described in the book of Exodus, then we have to try and reconstruct some other history as best we can to explain the evidence that we find. We talked last time about the possibility, even the plausibility, that early settlement in the hill country, which is on the north, in the upper regions of the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel, we would say today, where you have the coastal plain that's about sea level, and then the hills rise up before the drop-off for the Dead Sea Rift Valley. In that hill country, we can imagine a Canaanite people emerging, distinguishing themselves from the coastal plain people and creating a new identity for themselves. They may have derived their chief god, Yahweh or Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, from one of the Canaanite gods. And we saw a picture last week of the Canaanite god Yahweh with his consort Asherah and obvious genitalia, which again would be anathema to later generations of Jewish thought, but may have well been plausible in the context of the proto-Canaanite Israel split that's taking place in the beginnings of Jewish history. Again, we don't have dates, we don't have names, we don't have places. It's more of a trend that we're seeing in the archaeological record. Well, so we've gone through and cut out Abraham, cut out Isaac, cut out Jacob, cut out Joseph, cut out all the tribes, cut out Moses, cut out Joshua. Okay, when does it start? When can we start counting the history? And the period we're talking about today is called the monarchy period. This is a period of Israelite kings. And it's generally dated from around 1000 BCE to around 586 BCE. The beginning is the founding of some kind of monarchy under King Saul or King David. We'll talk more about those characters. And the end of the period is the destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE that leads to the exile of the Judean elite from Jerusalem and the destruction of that temple in Jerusalem. So those are our bookends here. We've got the founding of a monarchy at some point around 1000 BCE, and you've got the destruction of Jerusalem at the end of that period around 586 BCE. So a period of about 400 years. Now, the story of Saul and David is described in the books of Samuel and the book of Kings. You have Saul, who's chosen as a king because the Israelite tribes want someone to unite them and lead them in battle like other peoples have. Make us a king like other nations have, they ask Samuel. Samuel's a little nonplussed by this because as the preeminent prophet, he used to be in charge. Now the king is in charge, but it doesn't go so well for Saul after all. Saul is a really interesting character. He's sort of a manic depressive because there are times he's ecstatically joyful and there are times he's unable to move in his bed and needs a young harp player named David to come in and entertain him and enliven his spirits. He goes from confident to paranoid when David becomes more popular. Ultimately, Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle with the Philistines when David sits out on the sideline. And David ultimately becomes the king of the United Kingdom of all the tribes in one basically comfortable kingdom. Although if you read the story of David, he has rebellions too. His sons rebel against him. One of his sons is killed in a revolt against him by his own best general. He commits adultery and steals a wife from one of his soldiers. There's all kinds of very colorful stories about King David that are described in the book of Samuel, part 1 and 2. But in the end, David dies, as everyone does, and he hands over the kingdom to his younger son, Solomon. And David reigns for 40 years, not 39 years, not 41 years, 40 years. Maybe, again, a significant number makes us a little suspicious about how accurately historical this is. And Solomon also reigns for 40 years. Solomon actually builds this temple in Jerusalem and is the head of a golden age of this united monarchy. In the descriptions of the golden age of Solomon's kingdom, you get borders described of the kingdom that match what Abraham is promised in Genesis for the promised land, all the way from the Euphrates River to the Nile River on one end to the other. Now, the united monarchy doesn't last for long because Solomon and David are both from a southern tribe, the tribe of Judah. And the northern tribes begin to feel like they're being taken advantage of by these southern tribes. And so they object and they ask for a remission of taxes. And Solomon's son, Rehoboam, who has been raised in the palace and is a very privileged child, makes a very poor political decision. And instead of remitting the taxes, promises to double and triple them. And that leads ultimately to a split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so I wanted to share with you a text that describes this split in very telling ways. So Jeroboam is the leader of the rebellion who says, we're not going to stay under the heel of the southern kingdom. We're the northern kingdom, we deserve our own territory. But after making this split, he worries the kingdom may return to the house of David, the Beit David. If these people still go up to offer sacrifices at the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, the heart will turn back to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and go back to him. How can they be offering sacrifices in Jerusalem if we have our own kingdom up here? The border control is going to be a mess. So the king took counsel and he made, notice what he made, Shnei Eglei Zahav, 2 golden calves. Remember a story about a golden calf somewhere? Remember how it didn't end so well for those people who made the golden calf? It was a rebellion against Moses, right? And so perhaps the Moses rebellion story is actually projected back into the days of Moses and reflecting the tension between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel and Judah because of the choice of the golden calf. He said to the people, you've been going up to Jerusalem long enough. This is your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt. This is almost a direct quote from what's said in the book, I believe, of Numbers with the making of the golden calf. He said, one up in Bethel in the north and one up in Dan in the south. These proved to be a cause of guilt because they went to worship the one at Dan. He made cult places, appointed priests from the ranks of people who were not from the Levites. So he was choosing other people to be priests, and the Levites are jealous of their prerogatives. He put at Bethel the priests of shrines he had appointed to sacrifice to the calves he made, and he established a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month. Remember, the 15th day of a Jewish month is always a full moon, an auspicious time. In imitation of the festival in Judah, he established one at Bethel, but in a different month from the original months. And on the 15th day of the 8th month, he ascends the altar that he made in Bethel. So here is an attempt to break away from the southern kingdom and find a way to be independent in some way. Now, once the kingdoms have split, I'm going to go back to sharing that screen, but look at a different tab here because it describes in a nice way the split of the kingdom. You notice here now, here's the new map with the two kingdoms, a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. Their capitals, Samaria in the north and Jerusalem in the south. But you see the other nations around them. You've got the Philistine states still there in Gaza and Ashkelon and Ashdod, those major cities. You have the Phoenician or Canaanite city-states in the north, Acre and Tyre and Sidon and Byblos. You've got the kingdom of Aram Damascus in the northeast. To the straight east, on the east side of the River Jordan, you've got Ammon and Moab. And in the south, you have other tribes, including the Edomites, Edom. And all of these, by the way, have origin stories in biblical narratives. Remember, Ammon and Moab come from the children of incest with Lot and his daughters. Now, again, that's not what the Ammonites and Moabites thought, but it's how the Israelites described them because they're political rivals and fighting over territory. Now, when you have these two kingdoms so close together, sharing some common ancestry, there's going to be rivalries between the two. And in fact, the narrative in the book of Kings describes both sets, and it will say, this one was reigning for this many years. And in the middle of his reign, this one started reigning in the other part. It's sort of like a soap opera where it switches back and forth between the kingdoms. Here you have an example of this timeline where you have, I'll zoom in a little bit, hopefully you can see that. So you have Jeroboam the first and Rehoboam, but then Rehoboam dies and someone else takes over. And then during Asa's reign, who reigns for a long time, Baasha in the northern kingdom takes over. And notice, by the way, those little red marks, those are skulls and crossbones. Those are people who get killed. All right. Now, something else you'll notice is any color that's some variety of blue, be it a light blue or a dark blue, is from the line of King David on the left. And the green ones are a different line. And so you notice the line of King David lasts just about the entire period of this divided monarchy from the split around, let's say, 920 BCE after Solomon dies, all the way down to 586 when they're destroyed by the Babylonians. But on the northern kingdom of Israel, you get a lot of kings showing up and a lot of them getting killed by the next person, you know, as happens in monarchic systems. And there are multiple houses that are ruling. So there's no one consistent ruling house in the north. It's a much more fractious kingdom. And you'll notice their line cuts off a lot earlier because the northern kingdom is ultimately destroyed by the ascendant Assyrian Empire around the year 722 BCE. Now, the versions we have in the books of Kings that describe both of these sets of kings are very judgmental. It's what's called the Deuteronomic history that's giving a judgment on whether they were good kings or bad kings. Now, they're not being rated on being good kings or bad kings by the gross domestic product or by the balance of trade with the other peoples. You know, they weren't lamenting the trade deficit with Egypt at this time. They're judged as good or bad based on whether they do what Yahweh, the God, wants them to do. So obviously, the writers of the history have an editorial agenda where they want to judge the kings as good or bad based on their religious practices. We'll talk more about the Yahvistic Deuteronomic history and its judgment a little bit later in the class next week, or next class session, which is not next week. We'll be talking more about Yahvism. In the end, the Babylonian Empire destroys them, and they lose out in the inevitable push and pull of the ancient Near East. And you'll recall the map we looked at last time, which is the map of the Fertile Crescent. And the two major areas that are most fertile in the Fertile Crescent are the land between the waters, or Mesopotamia, which is where the Assyrian and Babylonian empires are based, and the lands of the Nile Delta, which is where Egypt is based. Now, the Israelites during this divided monarchy period actually have sort of a golden window to be successful, because the Egyptians are destabilized by the invasions of the Sea Peoples, which we talked about a little bit last time, and the Mesopotamian territory was invaded from the east by a people called the Gutians, and they destabilized the Mesopotamian empires for a period of time. And so it created a window in between those two major empires for the Hebrew kingdoms to grow, develop, and become stable. But as things get reorganized in first Mesopotamia and then later in Egypt, that window closes. And Israel now it finds itself pinched between the two larger empires. And it's torn because it says it wants to be independent under the kingship of Yahweh, but it has to be a client state of one or the other. And that's not a comfortable place to be. And we'll see that they get pinched between both of those. In the end, the Babylonians coming from Mesopotamia are ascendant. They conquer the land of Israel. They take the last king of Judah, whose name is Zedekiah, captive. And they actually, this is sort of a deviously cruel and brilliant maneuver. They take the king and they kill all of his sons in front of him, and then they blind him. But this is how they maintain control, because you can't establish a new king. The old king is still alive. He's just totally powerless. And there's no future line of kings because they've killed all of his sons and heirs. And this is in a kingdom, remember, the southern kingdom of Judah had David all the way down, all descended from the house of David. So the Israelites in the north have been gone from the Assyrian period of 722 and their conquest. And now the southern kingdom of Judah, destroyed by the Babylonians, is sent into exile. And will they survive or not? Well, we'll have to stay tuned and check back when they return from exile and see how that works. So that's more or less the biblical narrative of what happens. You have the kings, you have this monarchy, you have the Davidic monarchy. Well, how much of this is true? Well, we have to understand that the Deuteronomic history is an editorialized history. So it seems to assume that Judah, following David, following Solomon, was largely doing the right things vis-a-vis Yahweh. These are good kings that are following Yahweh's commands. And you'll see in the introductory essay, I talk a little bit more about the Deuteronomic history, where it judges the kings based on their obedience to Yahweh, and all geopolitical events are a function of their obedience to Yahweh. So a king that lasts a long time, you would think, would be a good king who was good for Yahweh too. Of course, the reality of the dates are totally off, because Hezekiah is a good king, but he almost gets the kingdom destroyed under the Assyrian invasion. Manasseh, after Hezekiah, makes accommodation with the Assyrian Empire, and is thought to be a terrible king because he does all these terrible things of worshiping all these other gods. And Manasseh rules for 55 years. And then the next king, Josiah, is a good king. He cleans up the temple. He goes back to worshiping the one God, and he's killed by the Egyptians. So it seems like history is sort of working against the message of the Deuteronomic historian here, even in the events recorded in this history. You see, there's a difference between hindsight and history. You know, hindsight is looking backward and judging things. History is trying to say what actually happened without getting into the judgment business. And because our primary source in the book of Kings and the book of Samuel has this Deuteronomic perspective based on, again, the ideology of the book of Deuteronomy from the Torah, it's hard to take every story on face value. I mean, was David good with his slingshot? Was he good at playing the harp? Could he write the Psalms? Like, again, we can't know any of that. And it's part of the house of David's propaganda to make him look good and make Saul look bad. Do we know if Saul was actually manic depressive? Who knows? Again, we only get the David side of the story. Again, we'll talk more about this dynamic of Yahvism and prophets and the kings and Jewish religious evolution during this period next time. We're more focused here on sort of the geopolitical side of the kings and the material culture found in the ground. In the end, of course, we know that history is not based on whether you're good or bad to Yahweh. History is based on geopolitical events and dynamics. If Mesopotamia is doing well, then you're not going to have a lot of space. If Mesopotamia is having problems, then you have space to be successful. One of the other challenges we have is that the events are limited because the authors of the Book of Kings had access to sources that we don't. But in a number of these chapters, it will say, and the rest of what Solomon did, is it not recorded in the book of the deeds of Solomon? Or the rest of this king's reign is recorded in the book of the kings of Judah. And we go, oh, because we don't have that book anymore. We can't turn to that. There was a book, evidently, that they were drawing from, but we don't have it. And so we only get a partial version of the story, and it's too bad. I mean, there's even confusion about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is on the borderline between the north and the southern kingdom. It's chosen almost as a compromise location. So remember how Washington, D.C. was chosen as a compromise between the North and the South in the founding of the American Republic in the 1780s? Well, Jerusalem was chosen as a central ground too, possibly as a compromise location. But it's not clear that Jerusalem was unoccupied at the time it was chosen. It could have been occupied by other people who were living there at the time. But it depends on which version you read. If you read the book of Joshua, they conquered Jerusalem and wiped out the Jebusites. If you read the book of Judges, the Jebusites are still in Jerusalem. If you read parts of the book of Kings, when David shows up, there's still people living in Jerusalem that aren't Israelites and Hebrews. So it's hard to tell which Jerusalem are you talking about here when you're deciding the history of the city and when it becomes the so-called city of David. Now, I've presented the challenges to the history for you, but there are actually some positives from this period because we do actually have real archaeological evidence that confirms elements of the Bible. Again, it doesn't prove David was good with a slingshot or a harp, but it might prove that there was some kind of David because we actually have a name in a monument. So this is from a stele or monument that was found at Tel Dan in 1993. And it was dated to around the 800s BCE, written by Hadad, who was part of the northern Aramean kingdom, and it's written in Aramaic, which is a related language to Hebrew, but it's written in what's called the Paleo-Hebrew script, so it'd be very hard for us to read. Hadad, who was the king of this kingdom, went in front of the god of this kingdom, and I departed from the 7 blanks of my kingdom, and I slew the king who harnessed 1,000 riots. And again, we don't know all the words because you see that the text is broken here, and there's marks and dashes and pits, and we just have to make our best guess sometimes. That's why I've got a lot of brackets here. But at a certain point, it becomes very clear what's going on. Someone was killed, the king of Israel, and also killed someone, Jehu, son of so-and-so, of the house of David. And the part that's in white in the monument here is where it actually says Beit David. And you can almost see there's 2 sort of triangles here. That would be the 2 D's. Well, referring to a house of David in the 800s suggests that maybe there was a David who started some kind of important house a century or 2 before. It's at least plausible. There's at least some confirmation that whatever was called the house of David in this period was significant enough to note when you're conquering a territory. So this is one piece that leads us to believe that there may well have been a David. He might have been a hillside bumpkin king, but maybe he was something more. In fact, there's been a lot of debates about that in the last 10 years or so, because later excavations in Jerusalem have begun to uncover what some call monumental architecture. Now, monumental architecture means big scale, not just a hut and a fire pit and a privy. I mean, privies are great to discover in the ancient world, by the way, because you can tell what they ate, and you can, when they had garbage, they throw it in the privy, and archaeologists love finding old toilets. But in this case, having a monumental architecture that's dated back to this time period of 900 BCE or 1000 BCE would suggest that this house of David was more significant than just a hill country bumpkin, as some scholars suggested. If he did in fact have monumental architecture, then maybe it was in fact a significant kingdom along the lines as described in the biblical text. Now you can imagine there's academic arguments back and forth very intensely about this question. But it is interesting to say that having a reference to Beit David, the house of David from this period, suggests there may be some validity to some David at some point in this era. Now, another example is the first depiction of a Hebrew king that appears in archaeology. He's a king from the Omri dynasty, which was a major dynasty in the north of Israel. In fact, it's sort of funny. The biblical story gives short shrift in the book of Kings to the northern kingdom. They pay less attention to it and more attention to the south. But the northern kingdom might well have been the bigger and more impressive kingdom based on archaeological records and ruins. More monumental architecture is found in the north than in the south in this period. And here's one example. Here's a picture of the first Israelite king to be depicted. His name is Jehu. He is the son of King Omri, who was the founding of that Omri dynasty. Now, if you have trouble telling which one is Jehu, it's the guy who's bowing down with his tush in the air. Not the most flattering picture for the first depiction of a Hebrew king. In fact, it's the Assyrians who are making him pay tribute. And you can tell it's an Assyrian king, by the way, because the Assyrians cut their beards square. You can see a square cut on the beard. That's a sign of an Assyrian monument. And the writing at the top is in a kind of writing called Cuneiform, which is done with a reed stylus to make the flat line or the triangle shape. And it took us a long time to learn how to read it, but eventually we do know how to read Cuneiform writing and Assyrian writing. And so we were able to decipher this inscription and know who this king was. Here's a description again of the king bowing to the Assyrian emperor Shalmaneser, paying tribute to him, because that's how you survive in a rough neighborhood. And the text says, I received the tribute of Yahweh, son of Omri. So again, a reference to the name Omri, which is the same name that appears in the Hebrew Bible, with a list of some of the gifts that he received in tribute. Not particularly flattering, but it does suggest some historical validity for the story of Omri as a king of a territory that was run into by the Assyrian Empire. And one other piece of archaeological evidence to highlight for today is an inscription that was found in a tunnel under Jerusalem called the Siloam Tunnel, which is a tunnel that connects a river and a pool into the city. And they found this inscription in the tunnel, written in writing that was dated back to the 700s BCE, based on the letter shape and vocabulary that was used. And it describes the story of the tunnel. There were axes going in both directions. And when there were 3 cubits left to cut, they would call out to each other through the rock, and they would aim towards each other so the 2 people carving would meet up at the right point. And when they met at the right point, the water flowed from the source all the way into the city. And the ground was 100 cubits over the height of the stone cutters. And there's an account given during the reign of King Hezekiah that describes how he was besieged by the Assyrians. And of course, when you're under siege, you need water. And it describes all the other events in Hezekiah's reign, all his exploits, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought the water into the city are recorded in the Annals of the Kings of Judah. Oh, again, wouldn't that be nice to have the Annals of the Kings of Judah, but we don't have it. But we do have this inscription describing the digging of a tunnel to get water dated to the same time period that Hezekiah supposedly reigned. And we have other confirmation for this as well. One of the sources I included in the course packet is a play I wrote for a middle school class, but it draws on the biblical account of the siege of Hezekiah under the Assyrians and the Assyrian account that describes the siege of the Israelites, the Judeans under Hezekiah. And it says, I imprisoned Hezekiah, Hizkiyahu, it says, in the Assyrian record, like a bird in a cage. So he was, in fact, besieged. And we have a burn layer on cities that the Bible says were destroyed that dates to the same time period. Now, the Assyrian account presents it as a great victory. The Judean account presents it as a great defeat for the Assyrians. So again, you're going to have to parse it between them. In fact, the Jewish account has one of my favorite unintentionally funny lines in the Bible, where it says the Assyrians came and besieged the city. And then God let loose an angel upon the Assyrians. And when they woke up in the morning, they were all dead. I like that particular phrasing. When they woke up in the morning, they were all dead. That probably didn't happen either. But the Assyrians didn't conquer the city. It says even in the Assyrian record that they besieged him but didn't capture him. He was a bird in a cage. So who knows? Maybe there was some plague that hit and the Assyrians withdrew. They didn't destroy Jerusalem, and Hezekiah and his line went on for another few generations. And we even have examples in a later generation. Now we're talking in the 600s BCE of King Josiah, who reforms the cult of Yahweh and gets rid of idols and fertility goddesses. Again, we'll talk more about this next time, but we have an archaeological trove of broken idols that dates back to the same time period as Josiah's reform. Again, provides some plausibility that if they were reforming the cult and getting rid of fertility goddesses, and here we have a garbage dump of intentionally broken fertility goddesses dating to the same time period, then maybe there's some plausibility there too. In the end, we're sort of captive to the archaeological record and the biblical story. And so we can say the biblical story is set in a plausible way during the book of Samuel and certainly the books of Kings. And we have some confirming records in the archaeology that confirm some names, confirm some places, again, make it a plausible version of the story. Maybe not in every exact detail, but in enough detail that it seems to be a plausible historical account up to a point. Okay, is that enough qualification for you? So this is our dilemma in looking at the monarchy period. Now, some scholars would say there's so much unknown in that narrative between the Hezekiah Tunnel inscription and the trove of broken idols. Who's to know what happened in between? That's a fair point. So they might date the history later. They might not date it till after the return from exile. There are even a few scholars who are what are called minimalists, who wouldn't even date any recordable Jewish history until the Hellenistic period, when you have Hellenistic sources talking about Judeans living in this time and this place around Jerusalem. So we'll have to, leave it at that in terms of the scholarly debate. They're still going at it, and I don't think they'll ever stop. That's part of how they stay in business. But I think it's plausible to say that there's enough evidence for this first temple period, as it's called, to say that at least some accounts, some basis of the Bible accounts is historical. Whether it was written later and it edited and claimed to be Hebrew and it wasn't, that's the minimalist claim, or whether it's all true, that's a maximalist claim, that this is basically a court account of the version of what happened, edited by some priests later. We'll have to pursue the truth in between and live with the maybe I don't know of real academic history.